You're tuned in to RX Radio.
I'm good. Thanks for making time for me. Oh, look at that.
Yeah.
You've got Anthony Bourdain in the corner. Man, you guys are coming hard.
We had to roll out the red carpet for you. You've been on our tops list since we were literally just talking about this.
Day one, yeah.
Since 2000 and we started chiropractic college in San Jose, California in 2011. 2011. So October 1st, 2011.
Yeah.
And you were the first guy to really be doing physical therapy chiropractic on the internet that I was aware of. Right? You were the same. No one really did that.
Yeah, I mean, I my gateway was becoming a supple leopard. I sent you an email as soon as I read like the first chapter of that book, and you actually replied, and it just like made my life.
Did he actually?
Yeah.
Ah, he's such a better person than us. Sorry, you haven't said a word this entire time. Welcome, dude. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, I want to say you guys need to have higher standards, obviously, and secondarily, shout out to all the coaches who answered my emails, everyone who is transparent, and young and hungry students. You reach out to the masters. Be thoughtful. Don't ask dumb questions. Don't ask anything. But you'll be surprised that everyone is paying it forward because someone did that for them. So I'm glad that you're the only one I ever emailed. I was like, of all the emails, this is the one. It's gonna come back. I was just down at Palmer this weekend in Dallas, what they've got going on, and I ran into so many students and practitioners who are moving towards this future of saying, hey, movement front and center. Progression, regression. Let's talk about why we're trying to restore people and mobilize people and manipulate people so that we can actually do the thing. And one of my slides is a picture of you hip sledding like 10,000 pounds or something. And then a couple kids come up and they're like, Jordan is my hero. Oh my gosh, you had him in your, he's like, have you ever been on his podcast? I'm like, Monday. And he's like, my world is complete. So the whole circle's coming around.
Well, this is the last episode of the podcast, so it's not going to get any better than this. We're done. Lundy, we have a producer here, Kyle Lundy. He's going to Lucius Fox it at the end of it. He's just going to write his name into it. The whole thing's going to delete. But you bring up a really interesting point, and Jordan and I were talking before you came on about things we wanted to ask, and this is basically just our own personal curiosity because you're like Sacagawea. And I feel like we're Lewis and Clark. And you settled the new frontier of the internet for manual therapists, but you reference coaches that you reached out to, right? Because you're at the top of so many people's lists and like had such a meta impact on the industry. Who was it for you? Like, who was it that, you were sending a kite out to and be like, man, I look up to this guy, or I like this guy's methods, or I like this guy's book. When you were coming up, who was it?
I'll answer that question, but one of the things that I think it is difficult to conceive of is that the internet wasn't what it is today. The iPhone doesn't have a video camera. We had books. You just couldn't. Joe DeFranco was the first coach who showed me the ugly warts of what a training session looked like. Yeah, cool. Mark Bell was recording training sessions too, but the very first, like the DVD or the VHS of Joe DeFranco coaching athletes, and I was like, oh, that's what a real session looks like. And those models of transparency, were so important because, and I hold it today that if you're seeing someone on the internet and they're, spouting, and you can't actually see what their work product is or how they work or talk to patients, but they're showing you some other model, that lack of transparency in this day and age should be a red flag. And, one of the things that I'm always interested in is I'm like, well, who is, like, I need to know some context about you as a coach or a practitioner. And again, some of those things are starting to come together. Coach practitioners are a thing, so it's not just coach or practitioner. But there's a lot of people who make a lot of assumptions who aren't actually working with people or high performance. One of the things that we're coming to realize and appreciate more and more, for example, is that, per Franz Bosch, there's more variation in waltzing than there is in sprinting, which tells us a lot about, you can make a certain set of adjustments or statements or, about someone or some situation that doesn't hold true across cohorts, that isn't stable across sort of skills and abilities. So you can say in this instance, this is true. And that may be true. And that is sort of where I think we've gotten to in strength conditioning some, and definitely in rehabilitative, performance therapy. What I'm saying is we have to have a decision about, hey, best practice means that I don't just do one technique and it works because someone's not going very fast. I teach to the highest expression of the movement. We're trying to give people open sources. And so I make a whole bunch of assessment what's the right word? I make a lot of inference about the work that I'm doing because I get to test it when people are going fast under high loads for long duration. And that really colors how I'm thinking about the statements that I make and my beliefs about the human physiology. That incorporates, performance nutrition and sleep and hydration and motivation. And does this person feel a member of the team? I mean, the biopsychosocial model, for example, which people like to hold up, that, humans are complex, messy, psycho-emotional beings. I'm like, no crap. Have you ever worked with someone in a high performance environment? Like that's the game. So what's happening a little bit is on the internet now, we're seeing people saying things that don't hold true under speed, under load, under, sort of the gnarliest conditions of the human being. So the earliest people that I reached out to were the people working in those fields who I could have access to, some of the strength and conditioning coaches, and also people who had been around for a minute, and had put a model out there. They didn't just do the old swoop and poop, but they actually tried to improve the ball and empower the young coach, young athlete, young practitioner with a model that could carry on to help their work. So people like Greg Cook, people like Stu McGill, it's easy to malign the masters. But I'm like, can I see what phone you were using in 1996, please? Can I see what car you're still driving from 1996? That's when the FMS came out. You remember the 96s? It was the dark ages. I don't even know if you guys were even alive in 96. And you know what I mean? Just think about where we are and how sophisticated we are now, and that is built on people working in the trenches, in universities, in the Olympics, trying to figure out in these professional environments, trying to figure out what's important, and then where do we put in the intervention to get the thing that's important. And what I think is interesting is that there's rarely any discussion now, not as much about like, should you sprint with your feet straight? Yeah, you should. That's really the best expression of the hip. You don't really run and cut with your feet turned out like ducks. So when we run through that filter of trying to understand what's best practice, I reached out to the people who were doing the work in the fields that were important to me, where I could see the test and the retest, where the transparency was. And in this world today, it's easy. There was some guy who, I was talking about, hey, I'm trying to move a lot of conversations away from pain, no pain. That has been the barometer of everything. Like, don't round your back in your deadlift because you'll get injured. I'm like, well, I don't think that's true. I have seen in my gym, where I actually coach people and Olympians and everyone else, a lot of rounded backs when it got heavy, or a little bit loss of technique, and no one died. I saw a lot of people pick up dumbbells with rounded backs off the floor before we worked on technique. And so, my experience is, hey, this isn't about pain, no pain, or you may or may not get injured. It's about that's crappy technique that doesn't transfer. And why are we saying it's okay, or developing this whole language of apologetics around incomplete positioning, poor technique, poor technical skill, which is sort of what we're pressing out there. It's good enough. Don't worry about it. And what I'm saying, I think now, what I think I'm interested in is, why are we not looking at the highest expression of what's possible and saying, let's keep moving towards that, instead of saying now, it's good enough. You can round your back. It doesn't matter. And again, if you get into some of these conversations on the internet, you'll see that I'm like, well, who are you working with? Why do you believe what you want to believe? And it comes back to context. So that's a long rambling say of saying the people I really respect and admire are the most transparent and working in the hardest situations and putting their nuts gonads better, can be gender non-specific, on the line about their outcomes.
That right there was an evolution of Kelly. That was, and that brings me to kind of my next question, or something that's always struck me as curious. Is you, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, Jordan was very much involved in the California CrossFit scene, West Coast regionals 3 or 4 times, competed with NorCal CrossFit at Wadapalooza. So he really indoctrinated me into the CrossFit community, where that's kind of was your big base, I would imagine, when stuff really popped off. But you, as you mentioned, elite level athletes, it wasn't just CrossFitters. How was it that, like, you alluded to a little bit the evolution of, back when we were looking at Joe D and Stu McGill, they wrote books and they'd put out VHS training tapes, which is so crazy. How is it that you evolved from, maybe CrossFit into, touching baseball teams, football players, Olympic athletes, and then where does that evolution led you from the weight room into, writing, now with the number of books that you've written, and also moving outside of training is something that I want to get into. Like, how has your passions evolved from, I would imagine what would have been a 24/7, 365 job, owning your own gym, plus your online content, transferring from the supple leopard Kelly Starret to mobility WOD, which was like, everyone was like, wait, who's this? Mobility WOD is now Ready State. And I was like, oh my God, this guy looks just like Kelly Starret. I just want to talk a little bit about the evolution of your career and where you see it moving forward, maybe outside of fitness.
My wife and I were professional athletes. We paddled on the U.S. We're national team paddlers. And so, when I first discovered CrossFit, I was like, oh, this is the first time where I discovered I am unskilled, not very strong, and have huge holes in my capacity. I'm a national champion. I've competed in world championships. I'm really a good athlete, wow, when it came to some formal movement, I wasn't fluent in kettlebells. I wasn't fluent in Olympic lifting. I didn't know the tenets of powerlifting. I couldn't. What I found was that, everyone comes out of some kind of movement tradition, and my movement tradition was poor. And so when I discovered CrossFit, suddenly I realized I had to learn how to run. I had to learn how to do all of these things. And when we kind of really started, Juliet and I were like, oh, this is the best way to train. Because what we were doing in the gym, we belonged to like Club One, right? Juliet is an attorney. I'm a young physio student. And like, we do like 20 minutes of throwing the medicine ball. And then we do sprints on the elliptic or the, Stairmaster. And then we'd go lift some weights. Like, I was already following Dan John. And then, I was taught, and then we go ride our bikes on the weekend. And then we, there was a lot of things. And suddenly when I discovered CrossFit, I was like, oh, this is a much more efficient way to get my heart rate up and to challenge my position with this intensity. And I think when people, when we started this thing a long time ago, I started CrossFitting in 2004, right? No one was fit, no one was strong. And that world has changed. I mean, people used to puke all the time doing CrossFit. Now there's P90X and SoulCycle and Peloton, and the intensities are high. No one vomits anymore. But the intensity piece, people weren't actually training very hard unless you came out of a university tradition or some kind of tradition where you were exposed to, and track and field early on. I think track and field has been nailing it with Olympic style lifting, accessory work, running, jumping, throwing. I mean, that really still ends up being the paradigm of good athleticism. So when we knew that we loved this and we saw it as a great model for us, and all of a sudden I was learning so much and becoming so much better advocate for understanding what my patients needed to do. And when we originally started this, I was explaining this nascent model, this emergent model that was kind of developing for me, and to my mother-in-law. She was like, oh, you mean it makes the invisible visible? And I was like, that's exactly right. Damn it. That's correct. I'm so easy to see that, you can put your arms over your head when you're fresh and moving slowly. But as soon as we add speed and a little metabolic demand, cardiorespiratory demand, competition, like your overhead positioning sucked, and you defaulted to all of the ugliness, which was exactly what we were intending to do all along in the gym. The goal in the gym is to find the limits of your abilities to hold your position. That's what we're doing. We're not training. I think it's confusing because, when we're trying to like make more durable tendons or rehab someone's ligament, or right, where we can be manipulating physiology for some kind of deficit if we're trying to repair or heal someone. So, BFR kind of is a good example. Like, you can do anything on BFR and it works, right? I mean, you can do quarter squats, you can do yes, no machine, you can straighten your legs out, you can bicep curl, it doesn't matter. No skill, but high physiology. But when we started to expose people to the high skill, what we saw was that we had a whole lot of people who weren't very skillful, and the gym suddenly was a really excellent way to understand complex movement behavior, where the goal of training, and I think the modern gym culture has sort of muddied the waters a little bit, where we got so interested in the gym because it was such a rich environment for us to understand what's going on, develop skills, develop capacities. It was a great community. We found our tribe and purpose again. But all of a sudden, we forgot why we were training in the first place. And that training in the first place was to go out into the world and do something. And I think that's where I started to realize I really had an excellent tool for helping people in sports understand what the heck was going on and why they couldn't throw the baseball at 100 miles an hour, or why they were, not able to turn the hip in the ring, or whatever, insert your favorite sport and euphemism here. But the bottom line is, as we started working more and more, and because we're in the Bay Area, people started finding us. And then I would get a data set, and I would be invited to the Marines, and I would help them solve some problems. And I would help them see things that they couldn't see because I had this X-ray vision goggle, which was called movement. Under training, under real loads and different demands, I could quickly figure out what the problem was. And because I was in physio school at the time, it was like I was learning like I've said this before, two big trees starting to kind of growing together. Can't really tell what's what. And my experience as a full-time athlete, when I got into physio school, I was like, man, these are not even the same language. It is crazy. I had to actually get on the phone with the American Physiotherapy Association, the CAPTA, California Physical Therapy Association, say, hey, can I mobilize someone for performance? Can I put my hands on them and restore their hip range of motion so that they can ski better and run faster? And they were like, yeah, sure, why not? And I was like, oh, okay. I've never heard anyone doing that. I only had heard that the only reason we'd mobilize a hip is because you had a labral tear or something going on. No one was mobilizing to improve position so that you can improve biomotor output. That thing, which is so obvious now, didn't exist. What we had in the world was training and corrective exercises. And I was like, well, if you come to me as a physio, I already have you training and I'm working on that. So I don't need more corrective exercises, which are tempo or isometric versions of the movements we're already doing, right? I don't need more vitamins. I just need you to eat better quality foods. And then over on this side, what I was like was, let's use mobilizations as position transfer exercises. Because when I was seeing, and again, my base of understanding came out of this Australian Maitland approach to manual therapy, which was, let's restore your ability to move using a mobilization or a manual technique, then stand you up and go over here and test that, right? It wasn't just like you're a desk-bound person and then you come over here and I restore your thoracic spine and then I'd let you sit on the desk again. That wasn't our model. So we start to add in, we get different data sets, we're invited to a different group, and all of a sudden we realize, man, we really may have something here. And that was when I started, I was already teaching a course called, like movement and mobility course, Chasing Performance. And the bar was so low. And the bar was low that people didn't know what their body should be able to do. They had a language of strength and conditioning, which was all predicated on, did you add another kilo to the bar? Did you do one more pull-up? That was the only yes or no. Does it hurt or not? And I was like, that's not very sensitive, because I've seen a bunch of really good athletes move poorly and break, move poorly and lose, move poorly and not be durable in their careers. But when we started really improving their technique, they became more durable. When we helped people apply those same mobilizations to improve their position, we saw that oftentimes their brain made different decisions about what was painful, what not was painful. And sometimes people had pain, but it was just such a simple, ember to step on, just simple myofascial, whatever, sensitization, whatever word you're going to use, I'm going to use that doesn't trigger people out here, right? But people did not, we treated pain like it was a medical problem. And that was horse crap, because we were seeing people self-medicate with ibuprofen and bourbon and THC and opiates, and they were ignoring it until it got so bad. So I was suddenly like, well, why don't we just control what we can control, which is these components of eating and sleep. Why don't we improve your movement capacity by just restoring what you're supposed to be able to do, and then let's improve your technique. And lo and behold, that seemed to be a really potent concoction to get people out into the world doing more heroic things with their bodies. And then, check this out. People talk, and people do what works, and they stop doing what doesn't work. You know what I mean? It was really, that was it.
So,
and then the internet was invented, and then Twitter and all that stuff. So
you've made 2 2021 auto corrections so far, if you've been keeping score. Well, because it's like, I think talking in this circle, and you mentioned that when we first started putting this together, you're like, can we not talk about training? And like maybe talking more about like the state of affairs, because I feel like it would be like magicians trying to pull magic tricks on one another. Like you'd pull a rabbit out of the hat, and then Junta would pull a quarter out from behind your ear, and I'd be like, I know how you did that. I know how you did that. But like I've noticed so far, you've made 2 auto corrections to the state of kind of the world in 2021. And I wonder how you've dealt with the evolution, not only of like, modes of thinking and fitness, but just the evolution of the world. Because you traversed a really interesting time where the internet wasn't as prevalent and pervasive as it is today. But now you need to operate as a professional and a businessman on the internet, which I think may be part and parcel to the 2 auto corrections you've already made. Like you use the word like, whatever doesn't trigger someone, and then you made another PC correction earlier on in the chat there. How have you? Because are you still currently in San Francisco?
We are still up in just north of the city in San Rafael.
Okay.
We have our gym and studio up here, our training center.
And you've always been like, and one of the things that drew us in was like you're kind of a shoot from the hip kind of guy. But you live.
Well,
go.
Well, I don't know if I'm shoot from the hip, but we can't wait around because it's not working. So let me tell you a story. This is probably a huge piece of this. One is that I grew up scaring the crap out of myself, taking big risks, paddling class 5, right? That was my thing. I raced, I paddled, I just 3 weeks ago was in Africa, paddling the Zambezi River, gigantic class 4 or 5 water. And so I'm comfortable being uncomfortable, right? And taking risks. So that's one thing you should know about me is that I'm like, we need to get in it and decide. There's an old maxim around this big rapid on the Grand Canyon called lava. And it's the biggest rapid on the Grand Canyon. And, lava gives people a ton of fear. And like the days down to lava rapid, like you're like, oh, lava's in 2 days, lava's in 1 day. Now you wake up and it's like, we're running lava today. And it's this big, gnarly kind of rapid. And then you run lava. And then what you immediately say to yourself is, well, could I run it again? I mean, you're already above it because the next time you're going to have to run it. Or could you walk up and do it again and just keep doing that? And the only time you're not in lava is when you're running lava. You know what I mean? And so when you're in it, you're like, okay, we don't have to talk about it or worry about it, let's do it. And I don't know if I'm shoot from the hip, but I'm certainly, hey, let's get into it and talk about it because, there's an old maxim, talk of bulls is not the same thing as to be in the bull ring. And we weren't doing enough talking from inside the bull ring. We were having all these erudite conversations from the outside. And I was like, you're not actually where the rubber hits the road. Have you actually coached 40 girls who are 14 playing volleyball, trying to improve their mechanics, and then reconcile with what you know about injury, with reconcile about environment? Because if you haven't, some of the decisions you're making and the assumptions you're making may be fallacious, right? You may be incomplete in your model. Unless you are standing in front of a big group of the Marine Aviation Weapons Tactical School, and these people haven't slept in 5 months. They've slept 4 or 5 hours for the last 5 months. You can't go in there and just talk about sleep density and like sleep better and like, hey, why does your body hurt? And like, hey, quit eating those, just quit drinking those Monster Energy drinks. You know what I mean? Like people are survival mode. So, the idea is first, let's get into it and talk. So I realized that talking as a coach was a lot better. And we started being transparent about what we were doing. And also, I didn't tell you what to do. I said, this works. And then I basically was trying to help coaches and athletes solve their own problems. And even today, I really don't put out a lot of like, do this, do this, do this, do this. I'm like, as a coach and athlete, you already know your ecosystem and system and your people. That's a decentralized model. The local coach knows her athletes and her clients better than I could here in California. So what I'm going to do is try to give better tools, and I trust that coach will be able to integrate those tools. And then simultaneously, it's not that I'm shooting from the hip or taking risk, but what we're doing isn't working. How's that? So are we seeing fewer injuries? Are we seeing fewer musculoskeletal problems? Are we having less depression, diabetes, obesity? I mean, choose something. Injury rates in the NFL, ACL injury rates in kids. I mean, like back surgeries. I'm like, seriously, choose something and tell me you're like, we're killing it. And you realize we've got this vertical of people who are like, yes, I removed 1 gram of protein from my block macro count and I got shredded and PR'd. And then we have the rest of the world. And I think what Juliet and I are really interested in now is saying, hey, look, high performance is our test kitchen. It's our laboratory where we can see what's what and what's effective and what's not. And that's a really good way to see if people, there are a lot of smart, bright physio coaches out there teaching models. And then I'll come into an environment where they've just been, because they're bringing in other coaches and outsiders, and no one is doing their stuff. And they're not doing their stuff because it doesn't integrate with their system, or it takes too much time, or it's not practical, or you have to do my things and you can't do any of the things that have gotten you to the world championship now. And so I'm very much a realist around, we have to make decisions about when and where we're putting these things in, what works the best, and what we're doing isn't working. So we have to take a little bit different model on it. So I don't know if I'm, shooting from the hip so much as saying, let's think about this a little bit differently. And I can't wait around for physical therapy to get off its ass to solving these problems, because it's never going to happen.
Yeah. But I don't know. For me, you mentioned the law of a thing, and that's really interesting, because we just had a group of coaches come through here, and it's, you just said we need to think about things differently. I find that with the level of information, not even level, the frequency and the pitch of the information available in this new clinician coach Instagram ecosystem, right? You planted the first seed, and then we have this industry. Like, it really wasn't a thing. I find there's a crippling overload that just leads to inaction and too much thinking, right? If it's one thing, like, you can tell me about lava, and I've been in, like, we both have parallel situations in our own sporting background where we know the anticipation is a big part of that. On the business end, like, when something happens, like, oh, this will be so sick, and then it happens and it goes exactly as planned, and you're just kind of like apathetic, and you're like, oh, all right, well, all right, well, I guess you're just constantly searching for lava. How is it that you impart the importance of just doing shit while also maybe shining a light on what to do? Because it's like, I'm very well aware that Jay and I are another voice in a sea of, like, just crippling amounts of information. And one of the things that, like, I've kind of veered to when people come to us for advice, I don't know why, is like, just do something. Like, just do something. Like, just get started. Fail fast was something he said to me when we first started, like, 6 years ago. Do you find yourself running into that issue of, like, okay, I want to put out a more transparent, as you said, way that this actually works when the rubber hits the road, but also the key part of rubber hitting the road is actually putting the fucking car on the track?
You're right now, where we have these, E.O. Wilson in his book Consilience. If you haven't read Consilience, you have to read Consilience. And my wife is kind of like shaking her head over here because it's a book that I'm like, how come you haven't read Consilience yet? My kids are like, I don't want Consilience tattooed, Dad. And Consilience, as he defines it, is the unification of knowledge. We need to understand how all of these things fit together. And what's great about taking that view is that I'm like, oh, you and I are solving the same sets of problems. You're just doing it with a different language. And thank goodness, because middle-aged 48-year-old bald guy Kelly doesn't speak to everyone. I'm not in everyone's camp. I'm not in everyone's community. I need allies to go with me to speak to their group. I don't speak to all the middle-aged women or young women out there. I just don't. There's gonna need a lot of us to come in. You know, a good example of this for people where we make this less sort of esoteric. If you go to the Olympics and watch the Olympic lifting, there's a lot of different kinds of Olympic lifting coaches. Right? I mean, there's Travis Mash, and then you've got Ma, and you've got, you know, all the brute strength guys. And, you know, all of a sudden what you're saying to yourself is, oh, wow, look at all these different training models. And then their athletes basically all move the same way and lift the same weights within a kilo or so. Right. And then there's Lasha. I don't know where he's from, but whatever. But the idea here is, man, you can have so many roads and styles coming in, and that might fit your genetics better. It might fit your anthropometry better. It might fit your community better. It doesn't matter, you know, but you're absolutely right that one is you need to get started and not argue about getting started. So in Consilience, E.O. Wilson describes it as artifacts of scholarship. So when we see people arguing about minutia, you know, I'm like, okay, this is great, but it's completely esoteric, doesn't change the conversation. It's maybe even important and sometimes irrelevant, but it is an artifact of the system just expressing itself with people becoming super hyper nerds. I always focus back and saying, well, you know, if this unification of knowledge, this kind of unified field theory, we're going to have to take a much bigger gestaltist picture. We're going to have to really understand why the martial artists train a certain way and believe, and why Gracie has a, you know, breath practice, and why, you know, why the gymnasts do this, and why, you know, our Olympic lifters are moving this way. And all of a sudden you really realize that, like, okay, human beings aren't that unique. We aren't that special. Your shoulder, my shoulder actually aren't that noticeably different. The difference is the width or the size of your humerus, but, you know, the shoulder functions principally the same way. And once you start to get into those principles, then you can kind of take these steps of logic around, again, looking at what best practice of the physiology is, and not this apologetics that, you know, what we see a lot of times is that people's systems work until they don't. And one of the ways that it's easy to understand what's going on when people teach, and if you're trying to understand, and again, the information that is available to you is complicated and sophisticated. You need to know nuance and context. I'll give you two examples. First one is that I just saw one of my chiropractor coaches, Travis Jewett, who's one of my homies, member of our staff, one of my good friends, kind of a teaching partner, sent me a picture or a little video where a good coach was asking some advice about a metatarsal fracture in an elite runner. And the guy is overstriding and you know, he's like, what do you think's going on here? And Travis and I were like, how could I possibly know anything about what's going on from this 5-second clip? I'm like, well, what's his training volume? You know, does he eat food? How much is he sleeping? Was there a big change in density? Like, I can't tell. I can say, hey, I see that in this snapshot of this motion, he doesn't appear to be running as effectively as he could, but I still don't know why he's doing that. Is he stiff? Did he get in a car accident the day before? Does he have an L4-5 problem? Like, why aren't his peroneals working? You know what I mean? Like, so there's a whole bunch of things we don't know. And this is why we need to always have a little bit more context. And simultaneously, you know, what we can be driving around is best principle of the human. So I just got back from Dallas this weekend, where I was teaching at Palmer, and I did 2-hour didactic piece. And in the afternoon, I was like, okay, move the chairs over and let's feel what I'm talking about here. Let's feel these things. And all I do in my courses, here's a caveat. If you ever come to one of my courses or I'm in a lecture, it's all a trap. I just set trap after trap after logic trap for you to step into. And like, you're like, oh, there's a rake, bam, hits you in the face anyway. And you're like, I'm like, hey, there's a rake, and bam, hits you in the face. And what I want people to feel is, unless you're doing it and feeling it and working it, even yourself, we've got to be able to identify the heart of what Sir Francis Bacon is claiming is science, right? So Francis Bacon's the father of the scientific method, and it's induction, it's pattern recognition through induction of large data sets. It means we have what we need now to understand what is best physiology. Do you like to back squat or front squat? We can have an argument about which transfer is better to functional. That's fine, right? You know, that is, you know, do you bench twice a week or 3 times a week in the NFL? I don't know. That's a great conversation to have. Does your benching schema work better than my benching schema? That's a great conversation to have. But I've realized that the thing that I'm working on more is trying to drive this unification between why can't you do what your body is supposed to do? Why don't you have access to shoulder extension, internal rotation of your shoulder? That seems to be a big limiter in your force production, in your sort of durability, in your biomotor expression. Let's just restore those things. And I don't know why that's so confusing, because literally all you see is supple leopard is that instead of just saying, here's your joint range of motion, I'm like, oh, here's how your joint range of motion affects your snatch or your swimming, or, you know, integrates with your neck, or, right? We're trying to overcomplicate the system when there are definitive principles that drive this complex human person. So, you know, when people are coming in, one of the problems, I'm like, well, I know your child is an elite pitcher, but she can't do 5 push-ups, right? That may be a problem. You know, working with all these people in this room of chiropractors, some of them were very fit and some of them could not do any of the things that I talked about, you know? So I'm like, hey, we haven't even established movement vital signs, or movement is a vital sign. We haven't established sort of principled minimums. And if we can, that's where we're going to have to be able to lift ourselves up if we're able to have the next conversation.
You mentioned Gray Cook earlier. I'm wondering, because a lot of early day clinicians, fresh graduates, they constantly look for models, right, to fill in the gaps, right? Because evidence is like what's best practice, what's in research, and like what is your own experience? So, like patient values, your own experience, and what's in research. So if you're coming out of school like we did like 7 or 8 years ago, so you don't have any experience, right? So you're just looking primarily at the research. So you haven't maybe established first principles. When you came out of school, was there a method or a model that you followed? And then was there any trepidation in like forming your own? Because, you know, coming from the chiropractic profession, both Jordan and I, it's like there's your Graston or your Gonstead or your Activator, you're this or you're that. And it's like there's no incubation period that starts to foster a unique thought process, right? And I feel like a lot of people, I'm wondering if you ever went through that. Like if you ever went through a point where it's like, you know, maybe it was FMS or SFMA, and then it's like, was there trepidation in branching out to solve problems that the nuance of the system didn't allow you to really make the invisible of that visible, right? Like, did you ever have any trepidation? Like, I'm nervous to post this. Have you ever said that in your own head?
No, because, you know, early on, you know, when I was a little bit older, I went to school, you know, I understood sort of that models always have to do 3 things. They have to explain what's happening, current phenomenon. They have to predict future phenomenon, help explain future phenomenon, and they have to be repeatable, right? And CrossFit used to be like observable, measurable, repeatable. And I was like, oh, I'm into that. You know, that makes perfect sense. And in physical therapy school, we had better, same, worse, right? Like I was always making a hypothesis and then testing a hypothesis. Every subjective interview, you understand some context, you're developing a hypothesis, then your objective assessment is to test your hypothesis. That's what you're doing. You're testing a hypothesis. I think this is the thing that's limiting your range of motion, or you're limiting your ability, or this lack of technique or skill or feeling is limiting your ability to flex your hips and squat like that, whatever. I'm making a hypothesis. So I came out of this tradition of this Australian manual therapy approach, which was make sure that the joint does what the joint is supposed to do. You know, I had a ton of fascial work and was exposed to the teachings of Ida Rolf long before I went to physio school. So I was like, oh, fascia seems to be very important here. And then simultaneously, I was also exposed to all of these very core people who maybe now aren't cutting edge, in their fields of powerlifting, Olympic lifting, whatever, but they were competent masters in the day. And what I was realizing was that, man, I need to reconcile all of these things. Observable, measurable, repeatable. Does this explain what's going on? And that's why I didn't actually I read Stuart McGill's book early on when I was in physio school about the spine, and I kept it in my bathroom. And I probably read the whole thing top to bottom like 10,000 times, right? Because there's a lot of poops in PT school. And what I realized was that was in terms of keeping with what I understood about functional movement, for example. Like, we work in a wave of contraction from trunk to periphery, from core to sleeve. Like, people love to throw the spinal engine in my face, right? And they're like, Grekovetsky, spinal engine. I'm like, yeah, of course. By definition, all good movement ranges from the trunk. Like, what are you talking about? It's not this rigid flexion braced machine. And some of what we figured out early on is that I was like, I don't think this language that I inherited from the people in front of me is working or serving us the way we want. Braced. We don't use the word braced anymore. Why? It's just a non-specific word that really confuses people and sort of thinks about a certain thing, right? That your braces means you're so flexed, you're flexing your cobra hood all the time. There's no dynamic. You're stiffened so much that you're afraid to take a breath or move in your life. I'm like, that's not probably great. Right? So we use the word organized, for example. Can we get your spine to the best position where you can generate the most force and still have the most access to your things like your pelvic floor or your diaphragm, or you can rotate your neck, or still have access to your scapular function, right? All of those things. So we love that sort of language evolution. We used to use the word fault, right? And I got that from Mulligan. It was like, it's a movement fault or a positional fault, right? We got this error, and I'm like, well, maybe it's not a fault or an error. Maybe it's what we call a compensation, which means someone is working or moving at the limits of their understanding or their limits of their tissue extensibility. They physically cannot flex the hip anymore, and it's not the brain limiting them, right? It's just that they're stiff AF, right? Stiffness is focus is what we'd write in the note. They're just super stiff. What we started to see early on is that I came out and I had this model of spine first. Let's really organize the nervous system. And part of that, again, I paddled myself off the national team when I ended up with a neck brachial plexus injury. And I had an overuse, pissed off nerve root, couldn't turn my head. My hand was getting numb, super weak. And I was like, probably should have protected my spine and neck first. And that meant I needed to have better shoulder rotation. I needed to breathe more effectively. I needed to not clench my jaw and grind my teeth, right? Yada, 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 yada. And all of a sudden, I come out of this model where we're like, I'm also hearing, hey, let's go midline stabilization with CrossFit. Let's really organize the spine whenever we can. And because everything was viewed through the filter of output, then what we were worshiping was these positions that allowed us to go faster or lift more weights. And I didn't find in my understanding that there was some kind of dissonance between putting people into better positions and going faster, or lifting more weight, or creating more wattage. How did I know? Well, I was testing that all the time. So suddenly, 2010, I'm working with U.S. Postal, right? And I've got a whole bunch of world-class Tour de France level athletes they're like, I can't stop my knee from doing this. And I'm like, you don't want to do that? They're like, no, that seems to be not good. And I was like, yeah, because when your knee is driving in, when you pedal, it's like a force leak. It's a gimbal. You're basically, instead of generating all that force straight to the pedal, you're like, well, then we'll come back. I was like, yeah, we see that in squatting. And I noticed that you don't have any internal rotation of your hip, and your calcaneus is super locked, and you're poorly skilled because you're in the sitting position all the time. So I was like, here are some things we can do. And then what we just saw was a change in output, a change in expression of the system. And then we did this crucial thing. Test, retest, share. I tested it. I retested it. I was like, I think this is what's going on. And then I'd share it and then be like, let me know what you think. And then people would be like, I set a world record. I went faster. My team won national championship. And that, begat, because sometimes if you drop in, I get these, there was a guy, again, coming back to this idea, I'm like, hey, super rounded back deadlifting. I just don't think it's great technical execution of lifting something up. Why? Because when you go fast, you can't do it. suddenly it's a dead end. You can't put your arms over your head from that position. You're not going to jump the highest you can in a rounded back position. If we're teaching people to move, then it's not just about who has the biggest hamstrings and glutes. It's about who is the most skilled mover at transferring the coordination from what we're doing. So suddenly we put skill and coordination into what we're doing. And what I was attacked on the internet recently about was people were like, they thought it, once again, I was like saying it's totally fine to round your, or not okay to round your back. And this isn't a conversation about pain and potential mechanism of injury. It's about, this is a poor technical transfer vertically through your spine. You're not going to be able to generate force and jump as high as you want. I showed that picture of you, on the hip sled, pushing a ton of the leg press. And I'm like, look, his feet are straight. His his arches are engaged. His back is flat. His head is long. I was like, can you see these fundamental principles that even in something like this hip sled press? And when we stop arguing about pain, no pain, and we start saying, well, does this skill or movement actually transfer something? Then, because fitness in the gym is just recursive and it's really hard to test the hypothesis, right? As long as I do more pull-ups, so I can do more pull-ups, so I can do more pull-ups. Pull-ups are a terrible sport, right? The reason we do pull-ups is to train certain movement positions, to restore movement techniques so that someone can go grab someone and tackle, grab someone and pull on a paddle, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how we've gotten here. I didn't really have a model that I was like, I'm afraid to do this, because my model was sport and performance, and I came out of a formal education system about the physiology and the movement practices, or at least what the tissue should be able to do for a human being.
I'm blown away that people still argue with him on the internet.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm kind of wondering too, is being such a forward thinker, was there a lot of objection when you started to think this way and speak this way about this different use of physical therapy and getting people to function more so than treating injuries? Was there objection to that?
Oh yeah, because it didn't exist before. And, the physios woke up to me late, because I'm a coach. Like, you guys are coaches. I'm like, are you guys even chiros? I don't even know. That's not even what
I gotta check.
Personal trainer.
I gotta check with the national board on that one. That's a really good question. I have no idea.
I have this conversation with my clinician friends who are also world-class coaches. And I'm like, what are you? It's like the predator is like, I don't know, you're not a man. What are you? Like that sort of thing. So, we weren't used to using our tools to improve people's positions for output. And if you've ever been in a chiropractic office or a physical therapy office with carpet and a hung ceiling where you can touch it when you put your arms over your head, that doesn't look like a place where athletes train. That doesn't look like a place where you have teams come in and condition. That doesn't look like, it looks like a place where you come in and you get out of pain, right? And I think, it's been a useful metric for me, sort of a couple things. I think this is useful for everyone if you're listening. One is, the breakneck pace is the glacial pace. Or let me turn that around. The glacial pace is the breakneck pace. This is how long it takes to change thinking and paradigms. And what you have to do is continually say the same thing, be in one place for a long time, be transparent, and just rinse, wash, repeat. And what you'll see is that there are people who come out with sexy, attention-grabbing models or new gimmicks or new ways of training. And if you just lay over principles on top of that, you're like, oh, this makes total sense. I love why he's doing it, or why she does this or believes this, but that doesn't really scale. And I still have to do a bunch of training around this. And how do I integrate this into a system? Or how do I get what you see is that, hey, principally, people are right. And the second thing I would say then is a useful metric in the internet, which, is that Oprah was interviewing Jay-Z, and she was like, what is the definition of excellence? And he said, performing at a high level for a long time. And that really stuck with Juliet and I. And the follow-up to what he said was, don't confuse being hot with being excellent, because people get hot. And in rap, they were like, yeah, look at that guy. He's super hot. I wonder what album he's going to put out in 10 years, and it's like, it doesn't happen. And in fitness, man, people get so hot and they are so popular. And I can think of 10 systems, organizations, people off the top of my head who are super hot, who you just don't hear from anymore. And the definition of excellence is to continue to serve your community, continue to be transparent, continue to coach. And I think that is the big takeaway here, is that I don't think you guys set out to necessarily be like, have a brand and like you set out to be like, we love coaching. You did set out to do that?
No, God,
No,
no.
you said-
We still don't know what we're doing. Are you joking? Our whole life is going, oh, God, what do we do today?
But what you love is you knew that being a coach was an incomplete model to understanding how to restore people's positions or getting them out of pain. So you guys went to this formal graduate school, but you never lost sight of the fact that you may have lost sight, but you didn't lose sight of the fact that what was most important was what you were doing in training and the expression of that training and helping other people meet their training goals and needs. So your formal education never got in the way of what it was. It was just you got a classical education in how the body works so that you could be better coaches and better allies to people trying to untangle, understand their physical selves.
Yeah.
And our old model was go as hard as you can until you break and then back off and go a little further and hope you don't break next time. That was honestly the old model. And now we're suddenly like, do you have to break? Do we have to break all the eggs in order to find no, we don't.
I want to double back quickly because we originally said, who would dare argue with you on the internet? And prior to that, in the conversation, I was like, well, one of the barriers for coaches to just start doing anything is the level of information or magnitude and frequency and pitch of information. I think another barrier of entry into this digital space is the fear of getting trolled. Now, excellence is defined by just showing the fuck up and performing well over time. You've been doing this since it started because you were the one who started it. You continue to do it, yet you still continue to get blowback, heat, trolls, whatever. Do you remember the first time that you maybe got into a bit of like a tiff or a knife fight on social media about, a theoretical concept in training? And how is that evolved? I'd love to be a fly on the wall, and this is a video podcast that I can see your face.
I don't have trolls. I don't have anyone. Everyone agrees with me. Just kidding.
No, I know.
My wife, so the best one that starts to come down to is that we were seeing people squat with the collapsed arch, crappy back, and knees slamming in. And their technique would hold when they went slow. As soon as it was fast, boom, knee came in, bam, counter movement. And I think that's what that knee valgus is. You're weak, and so your body's like, I got to create a counter movement out of the hole so the knee slams in. So you just bounce off the adductors the same way you would bounce off your hamstrings in the bottom. But if you don't have hip range, or you're stapled, or you're weak, or you don't have the control, or you put your foot into a position where it's turned out enough that your glutes don't even work anymore, you're going to have a different solution. And then that's what that knee coming in is, right? So remember, this notion of over cueing is to get a result. And because no one has context, the first, I think, big shitstorm I got was I was like, maybe you should shove your knee out, So we were saying knees out because what we were like is like, I need to have a cue where your knees don't come in, right? And I remember even, talking to, Chad Wesley Smith about this, and I was like, well, so if your knee comes in, what do you say to your athletes? Like, knees out, like he even knew you have to use it. But what people were doing was they were just shoving their knees out and like squatting on the knife edge of their feet. I was like, dude, who's doing that? Like, why are you doing that? Why are you suddenly taking this so far that you're like a baby putting the ball of its feet together trying to squat like the Buddha? That's not what I said, right? I'm trying to limit the fact that you're collapsing under high load and high speed, and that is a mechanism of crappiness. And so what ends up happening then is people want to argue and tangle. And the first time I watched this was low bar versus high bar back squat. Mark Rippetoe versus Everett, right? Remember that? That's so old school.
Just grab the popcorn like Michael Jackson.
What I remember thinking is, they're both good. And why can't you do both? Because Louis Simmons was like, yeah, we're going to go super high bar and then low bar. Now it's safety squat bar. Now it's cambered bar. And then it's trap bar. And then he's like, now put your feet together and now go super low. Like, what we, I know West Side. What we were realizing was I was suddenly like, what's the goal? And if you know Ripito was like, hey, I see a lot of people who are well conditioned who aren't very strong. So let's introduce some people to some 5x5s. Let's do some foundational strength stuff, and let's not just condition ourselves to death where we don't have some basic capacity, right? And that was a really big message. Again, 15 years ago, the world has changed. So Mark stepped in and was like, hey, if we low bar back squat, we can get the most people squatting. And no one heard that, right? His book was called Starting Strength, which is a really good entree into putting a barbell on your back and squatting. But you also have to understand that Mark came out of rodeo and had a sprung pelvis, right? Honestly, he ripped his pelvis apart, right? In a day, he had to squat in shoes in order to allow that position to happen. And he realized that if you turn people's feet out, you could get everyone squatting with the bar low on their back because it's basically a deadlift, right? And it's a short lever deadlift. Basically, you move the bar all the way down over the scapula, right? You turn the feet out so people can actually flex their hip. And suddenly you're like, oh, okay, this is a really great way to get everyone under some load. But it's not the end all be all. That was the missing part of his conversation. He was a genius in getting 100% of the people to start back squatting. Then you have Everett over here who's like, I'm an Olympic lifter. And sport happens with an upright torso. And if we put the bar down and we always have people bending over at 90 degrees to squat with their feet out, they're not going to receive, and that doesn't transfer very well. So suddenly what we realized, and I think it was, I don't know who it was, maybe it was Pavel. Someone's like, yeah, I really like front squatting better. Maybe it's Dan John, because it transfers more to sport, where we're actually exposing full range of motion of the ankle, full range of the hip. And then this is also a gateway drug for power cleaning and Olympic lifting, right? And for Greg, what was lost in the conversation was, wow, you may not have the access in your ability and your technique and your range of motion to be able to squat like this, right? So that your low bar back squat is not a choice, it's the only option you have based on your range of motion. And that is, I think, still part of the piece that's missing from this big conversation is, well, a lot of people are making decisions and proclamations about the way they move predicated on it's the only way they can move. One of the things I want to suggest to you is if you're bagging on someone's system, you should be able to take your perfect body developed in your perfect system and drop it into someone else's system and thrive, right? You may not be as strong at their signature movements, but you should be able to drop right in. We saw that with Ido Portal going right into MoveNat, and he was able to do it all, right? And he was like, hey, this MoveNat thing, I think it's great, but if you train over here, you have more trainable skills that can transfer over. So one of the ways that you should be able to test your fitness or test your skill as a mover is that I can come right in. I think Ghostface is doing that right now with Joel Seedman, right? He's like, I'm only going to squat at 90 and do all these weird things and test my ability in someone else's system. I'm like, that is the coolest thing on the internet right now, right? Instead of having an argument, like, let's see how transferable your patterns are.
Compare the day, however many years ago, when you're getting grilled on the knees out, your reaction versus your reaction last week. Unbeknownst to some people, I got into a tiff with a guy on the internet, and I knew he lived in Boulder. And I tried to get a hold of him, and I couldn't get a cell phone number, so I booked a flight to Boulder. I was driving to the airport. I was like, I'm just going to show up where I know he trains. And I was like, that's how much it aggravated me that this person was taking a shot at me on the internet. What is your tolerance for dealing? Because you're like the most level-headed. You're the best of us. Let's be honest. Like, we're terrible, irrational people. Maybe I am. You're guilty by association because I keep a ball-peen hammer in the door of my truck. But it's like, how has your ability to deal with it? Have you always
just
had...
so you know, I have a punch dagger that hangs off of my steering column.
Shut
Solid.
up. Dude, what the hell? You got to go move up to Sacramento with Mark, man. That's not a San Francisco move.
I work with the DEA, and I have some friends who are like, this punch dagger I keep behind my belt will go through a motorcycle helmet. I'm like, how do you know that? I don't want to know
Just
that.
in case.
So now it's just right
Scientific
there.
method.
It's just right there. My wife one time put the flap down. She was driving the truck, and this plastic shiv knife fell out and landed stuck in her leg. And she was like, "What the hell?" I was like, sorry.
Kelly's just got a shaved toothbrush. He's just got a shaved toothbrush in the center column. It's a toothbrush, officer.
So let me say that if you're I'm trying to swear less these days.
Fuck no.
If you're a dick on the internet, you will get blocked.
Oh.
Because that's not I just say, well, would you say this to me if we were sitting around the table? You know, I'm 6'2", 238. I can fight. You wouldn't say that to me. I'd box your ears. So if you're not civil or don't come in with curiosity or want to have a conversation, you don't get to sit at the table anymore. Remember, my social media is my social media. I have put out thousands of pieces of content, we're at like 6,000. I can't give away more of my thinking, be any more transparent. So if you don't have the guts or the willingness to go and do a little deep dive or actually have a conversation, hey, I'm not sure I understand what you're going on there, right? Because every coach on the planet, you know, I called Mark Ripito, just called him up, found his number, called him up, and I was like, Coach, will you explain how you think adductors being short drive that knee in position? And he explained it to me, and I was like, thank you so much. Like, young coach, I want to understand what you're thinking. So when you're seeing someone, here's the caveat for everyone. When you're seeing someone coach, don't look at what they're doing. What problem are they trying to solve? Is that useful to you? So that's a useful way of us trying to figure out what the heck's going on. When people are uncivil on the internet, and it's so easy to be uncivil and be a keyboard warrior with your 225 back squat, you know, you don't know what I know, and you're making a lot of assumptions. I definitely would take it way more personally. And now I really am trying to be like, well, where are you coming from? Where is your education background? Who are you working with? Why do you believe the way you believe? And I use all of the questions that people pose at me as opportunities to clarify my position, because I realize that I haven't explained it well enough if there are these big holes in that. I will say there have been several people where I have gotten their number and I've called their gym and I've talked to their staff and I was like, please have so-and-so call me back. And I never get a call back. And that it's so easy to be matcha on the internet. But when I call up and be like, hey, I really love to talk to so-and-so. And I reach out to DM all the time with people, you know, who like because what we were taught on the internet is the easiest way to get attention to yourself is to take down someone with more followers or who's been doing it longer or disagree. That is the easiest way to be like, look how important I am, because I'm going to just piss in your eye or spit in your eye. And what I will do is, hey, here's an example. People love to ask, what do you think about so-and-so? And they say it in the comments. And I was like, well, I would never publicly comment on their system because A, I don't know their system. I haven't investigated their system. I don't know them. And I'm not going to setting us up to have some kind of face-off, right? Some fan WWE wrestle match. And so what I'll do is I go offline and I'm like, hey, I'm going to erase your comment because this isn't a competition and I don't know this person. I don't know their methodology. So I'm not going to comment on it here from looking down from Olympus. Right. And if someone is a total jerk face on the internet, I will go ahead and go onto DM and say, hey, why don't you email? Here's my phone number. Let's talk about this if I think it's that important. And if you're uncivil, block, gone, you know, or you can do an Eric Cressy, just mute them so they can see your stuff, but they can't comment. That's super mean too. But
I didn't know he did that.
You have to be willing to, if you're going to put yourself out on the internet, be willing to have a lot of conversations. That's okay. Here's what I believe is because why? And my wife and I have a couple things that we say to each other. One is, you may be right about that, right? And what that does is there's some things I'm like, I know I'm right. Like, stop that. Like, I'm right. But if someone has a point, because I'm critically thinking, I'm using, you know, I drop in, I watch so many of your guys' videos, right? Because I really like how you teach. I like how you coach. I like how you think. I like how you talk. And maybe that's just all confirmation bias because we're all handsome. Or, right, I'm learning a lot because I'm a voyeur into the Chinese weightlifting system. I'm a voyeur into this powerlifting system. I'm a voyeur into Travis Mash. I'm a voyeur into, you know, Aaron Horshag. Like, I watch everything. And for the first time, I don't have to get on an airplane and travel to work with a coach. I can watch the coach teach and coach all day long in these little micro snippets. But you never see me comment on something I don't have the context to, right? And let me tell you a story where I learned my lesson. the first Star Wars comes out. I'm super stoked, right? I'm talking about Rey, this next generation, and I see Rey running, right? Daisy Ridley's running, and her knee is valgus, and her foot is locked out, and she's running terribly. She's overstriding, and she's running through set. And meanwhile, John Boyega is running right next to her, like Usain Bolt. And I was like, oh. And I thought to myself, this is why women tear their ACLs. And I was really I had a bunch of kids playing volleyball, right? And I was like, so I made a comment on the internet that I had such high hopes for the next generation of Jedi, but then Rey cut toward her ACL and became a Jedi statistic, right? And then I was like, I'm so topical. That's so funny. How I love Star Wars. Like hashtag Star Wars is the best. I'm a genius. And a week later, my wife is like, man, we just got this scathing email from this woman who's really bummed out about something you said on the internet. I was like, well, what's her name? She's like, it's kind of familiar. Like, do you know Daisy Ridley? Who's Daisy Ridley? Why do I know that name, Daisy Ridley? So Daisy Ridley, the actor, had seen this email, this tweet, and was super hurt. And she let me know that I was a jerk. I was a total dick. And she was 100% right, because I don't know what's going on with the athlete in that moment. I don't know what's going on in their life. I don't know what's going on with their injury history. I don't know going on their movement. I don't know if they even have access to coaching. And I was like, I will never comment on anyone's movement on the internet ever again, because I just hurt Daisy Ridley. And she was 100% right. However, the follow-up, the happy story is that you'll see that her feet get straighter and straighter and straighter. She becomes a Jedi, which I think really helps the arc of the whole conversation.
So like, you're welcome, George Lucas, for really pushing it's like a metaphorical storyline. That's you. You're the catalyst. You're the hero we needed.
Look, I'm just a guy who likes to squat with his feet straighter, and but the question is, again, right now, the Google considers anything longer than 90 seconds as long format. 90 seconds. So we're talking about the brain, which is the most sophisticated structure in the known universe, attached to a body, which is equally as sophisticated as the brain in terms of problem solving and survival and movement. And I'm going to make something really useful for someone that they can digest in 60 seconds or less. And now, since we're trying to go into Tuck Talk, I have 15 seconds to make a point about how your body works in the context of your life. And what I'll say is, we're back to this type 1 error where your gym person, your practitioner is making statements about your movement, but she's never watching you move. She doesn't show up at your gym. She's not in your kickball league. Like, you know what I mean? So like, is the medical rehabilitative model through physical therapy and chiro, is that the place where we should be helping people to move better? Well, I don't know. How many times a week can you see your strength chiro? Well, I see him or her 3 to 5 times a week in the gym for an hour. Okay, that's great. Oh, you saw your chiro for 8 minutes, once a week, and you thought that was going to be sufficient? And don't get me wrong. Let's talk about this. If you tear your ACL inside the Kaiser Family Foundation network, you'll see a physical therapist 3 times for that ACL. Then you go to a class that's once a week for 4 weeks, and you think that that's sufficient ACL recovery? Again, we have a type 1 error where I don't think this old medical model where you treat someone's pain is the way where we're going to change foundational behavior, which means we have to go into the places where people are exercising. That's the gym, that's the YMCA trainer, that's the Peloton coach. Those are the people coaching. So we better do our best to start serving those people and upping their game.
Have you had a difficult time? Like, you seem to have reached more audiences than fitness would otherwise allow you to. And you also simultaneously, I think one of the things that gives you a lot of deference to speak your mind is you don't, and which is crazy because I don't think there's anyone more identified by their thought process than you. Like, I've had this conversation with people in the last week going, we're getting K-Star on the podcast. They're like, who? I'm like, oh, Supple Leopard. And they're like, oh, okay, yeah, I know that guy. Which is crazy because they're synonymous, right? You're synonymous with CrossFit. You're synonymous with strength and conditioning. You're synonymous with physical therapy, rehabilitation. But you also seem like you have a life outside of this, and your identity isn't this direct link at a personal level. And I think that's what gets a lot of people when they attack, like, whatever model they ascribe to or subscribe to. It's because you're like, this is just like, I show up here and some people lift some weights, and I go, I don't know, maybe this way. And they go, oh, that kind of worked. I was like, dope. I'm going to go home now, and I'm going to go like travel. And like, because you mentioned, and I actually saw Matt right after this, you were just in Zambezi, right? You seem to be able to navigate this very effectively, albeit simultaneously occupying a space where you and your brand and your thought process are the exact same to the outside world. But it seems like you've been able to carve out a very, like, I feel like you log off and you just don't spend time in this crazy echo chamber as much as other people do.
I think you're right. I think so. First of all, you should know that my wife describes me as a little ADD, ADHD, right? I am obsessive. I obsess about things. And so, yes, I log off, but that's on the obsession and iteration. And I noodle and noodle. Juliet calls it, she actually has a terminal, like, she's like, oh, you're gone. Where are you? She's like, oh, are you knees outing? Where I'm just coming up with reasons why the foot should be in this position, or I think this is better alignment of the hip, or this transfers more, or why is this technique, like, there's no end to me. And look who I just went to the Zambezi with, Matt Vincent.
Right.
Like, do you think we stop talking about any of this stuff all the time? All my friends are super nerds. My wife is a 3-time world champion, loves to train. She's the greatest training partner I ever had. What I have, luckily, is some really excellent friends, and I have daughters who do not give a crap about any of this, right? And so I think, the candle that burns twice as bright burns half as long. You're welcome, Rutger Hauer. But the issue here is sustainability. And you're no good to us burned out and dead. And what we do see is a lot of burnout in our field because it is so intense and the battles can feel so pitched. What is interesting to me now is the second half of E.O. Wilson's Consilience, which is the highest calling of science is to inform the humanities. That's why science exists. And pure science is cool, but the highest calling of science is to improve how people live and function. And I think the highest calling of strength and conditioning is to transform society. So my goal now is to say, look what we've learned in high performance, but we're leaving everyone else behind. And so for me, the sort of next thing is something I learned from one of my first coaches, Mike Bergner, around Olympic lifting. I went and I knew that I needed to become really competent at Olympic lifting. I didn't know why, but turns out that being able to change direction and those tenets of Olympic lifting really transferred well to athleticism. I was like, I need to understand more about gymnastics. I need to understand more about Olympic lifting. So I would fly down and coach for him for free. For some reason, I weaseled my way in. He let me be just a fly on the wall in his seminars, and I would get him coffee and move plates and sometimes coach the young kids. And early on, I figured out that Mike Bergner was able to teach high school 14-year-old kids how to snatch a PVC pipe, and that he had kids who were of his own and people who were training in his house were going to the Olympics. And I was like, whoa, how do you coach at either end? And more importantly, what I realized was that his through narrative was contiguous, that the skills that the 14-year-old learned were contiguous with building in the complexity, intensity, and volume of going to the Olympics. And for me, that was a crystallizing moment where I was like, whatever I'm doing should really scale across the cohort, whether I'm talking about injury or pain with someone, where I'm talking about a world champion who's had a bad season, and we're talking about, the psycho-emotional aspect of that, the practices and the physical practices and the physical constructs all the way through. I need to make sure that one thing leads the other, because traditionally what's happened, especially in rehab, is we're like, this is Esperanto. You're going to speak classical Greek, and then good luck. You can forget the classical Greek and go now speak English or your whatever language you're speaking in your training. So I became much more interested in what is this through narrative. So that also works backwards. So if this is what's best practice for our men and women and people at the highest levels of performance, why can't we start to work our way backwards? And what we have done is said to people, pain is just in your brain. Right, we've pain-splained our way where you can't control any injury. Injury prevention is impossible, right? And I'm like, is that true? Like, I don't think that's true. That's not true. That I have more effective people who sleep better, who eat whole foods, who are hydrated, who are well rested, who are stronger. Those people seem to get injured less to me. And then, of course, the research bears that out. So how can we take those lessons and actually apply them to society so that we don't have this have and have not? And I think that is probably what I'm going to spend the rest of my career doing.
Well, what's next? Because like supple leopard to desk bound seemed like, I don't know, it seemed like an interesting jump.
Left turn.
Right, yeah, but as a left turn for someone who's identified, anyone else in your situation who personally identifies with their process, their mode of thinking, that would be a left turn. But if you're identify with the process itself and you just see problems and trying to bridge this gap of high performance back into society, then that follows a natural progression. Given the right reference point, desk bound makes a lot of sense.
And if you understand the principles in supple leopard, spine first, restore positions, manage breathing, organization of the body to be durable, right, in isometrics, then you all of a sudden you're like, desk bound is just a different application of the principle, right? Mm-hmm. That principle has to hold constant across cohorts. One of the things, the reason we got interested in that book is that our kids suddenly became school-age kids. And Juliet and I went in there and we're like, our kids can't sit all day long. That is like, we have this growing, evolving body that's falling into this sedentary behavior and is trapped in this chair. So we went in and switched our kids' schools. You know, our kids went to the all standing, non-sitting elementary school in the world. We converted the whole school, and now we're in like year, whatever it is now, a billion years of all these kids who've never sat in a desk. And we did that because suddenly we were back in working at Google, and I did a Google talk in 2010, and we were helping them untangle all of these musculoskeletal problems they were seeing in their workplace, right? And what the pain splainers would have you believe is that we can't control that. It's just in your brain, and slouching is okay, and it's totally okay to sit. I'm like, of course it is. It can't be the only movement behavior you have, right? And then transfer backwards, and again, you can see the ideology of my thinking. I'm working with a university football team who can't solve this deficit of hip extension, and it's because their kids are sitting 8 to 10 hours a day, and it's just their interventions weren't sufficient for them to overcome that sitting deficit. Then you go back to me in PT school, and I'm doing a case study about a woman with orthostatic hypotension in the hospital who continues to detrain and get worse and worse because the half-hour intervention I have with her isn't sufficient for her to become robust enough. So I start coming in the morning, I start coming in after work, I start coming in on my breaks to get this woman out of the hospital. And you suddenly see that is a total continuum of my thinking.
What's the next left turn?
Well, Juliet and I are really obsessed with, helping organizations at an organizational level solve some of these musculoskeletal physical health issues. We're trying to put movement as a vital sign, movement as a foundation of health. And that seems to be very confusing. I'm like, sit on the ground, go for a walk. I think Jesse Burdick just put up a great study that people who walk 16,000 steps a day, do you see that? Yeah. Like walking, he's like, it turns out to be more important than how fat you are is how much you move, right? So yeah, being obese is not great, but if you're comparing being skinny to being fat versus walking versus not walking, or active versus not, being active matters more. So we are right in the middle of trying to help society level up. I think what gets the conversation gets crazy because you and I are arguing about what's the fastest way or the best way up Everest and what tools we're going to use to do that. And I'm like, hey, shouldn't we get everyone to base camp before we climb Everest? And so we're working on a book right now called Built to Move, which is really the piece that's missing from supple leopard, which is what are all the low-level environmental considerations that someone could have to be durable, not to be fast or to be strong, but just to be durable. And we're seeing the erosion as fast as we can coach and get people moving. We're seeing that the environment is sort of slipping out underneath people's feet. and suddenly they're not walking, they don't eat whole foods, they don't sleep, they don't get sunshine. So this built to move piece is really like the environmental piece that should fit right in the middle of upper leopard. It's the if you have chronic pain or persistent pain, this is the book your physician should give to you about writing some of the physiology, or your workplace should use, or your doctor or physical therapist can give to your grandma to say, hey, this is accessible to you. We need to get you standing up and down off the ground more so that you don't fall when you're 80. So that's really where we're going into public health a little bit, I still love going fast.
Well, as you've evolved to answer different, more challenging questions, let's say, have you ever retroactively looked back at some of the answers to questions you've had and changed your mind? And if so, what maybe thought process or beliefs have you maybe changed from the beginning of your career to now? Or what were maybe difficult ones?
Yeah, I think, again, some of the language we used wasn't as effective as it could have been, for sure. The principles haven't changed because people have been trying to go fast, and I think I went back to the first set of notes I had in my original course, and I talk about breathing and parasympathetic impact on the body, but I didn't really appreciate that I could use breathing to help with low back pain. That, people like Perry Nicholson of Stop Chasing Pain, really, I wasn't driving lymphatic and decongestion as much as I needed to. I wasn't, some of the things that I thought were super important, like every human being needs to deadlift 400 pounds, otherwise they're not human. Like, maybe you don't need to squat as much as you thought you needed to squat. You need to definitely deadlift and hinge and practice your squat, but maybe squatting isn't as important as we thought. For the average person, don't get me wrong, I still squat a lot. My kids squat. I do 50 overhead squats every day I work out. So just so we're clear, with the PVC pipe. So I squat and squat and squat and squat. But I think I've gotten a lot more reasonable. And I also think that I appreciate that the way I have certain feelings about what your training should look like. But really, I do think that whatever, and this is probably bled in, which is confusing to everyone, but fitness as entertainment, right? It's okay to be entertained with fitness. We just need to make sure that you're understanding that that's incomplete, right? I understand and appreciate yoga a lot more. I understand and appreciate Pilates a lot more, but again, still see those as incomplete practices. So, I think Juliet and I've gotten a lot more reasonable. I think that's what it comes down to. Like now I'm like, well, did you sleep? Did you walk? Did you drink some water? Do you feel loved? And I'm like, then did you smash yourself with heavy deadlifts? Okay, now we can have a talk, so.
Do you feel like you'd be as successful as you were if you started out reasonable?
I don't know. I always thought I was reasonable because I think what was really important to me maybe was different, and it was a different era, right? When we made the first video, I set out to make 365 videos on YouTube. I'm just going to brain dump. And part of that was for me so that my patients and clients and athletes could come in. And I was like, you should have done these things before you saw me. Like what you're asking me for you think is complex, but it's actually not a very sophisticated problem. And it's actually a waste of your time and a waste of my time because you could easily handle this yourself, right? And when we started this, the iPhone didn't have a video camera, right? That's how crazy it was how long ago it was. I mean, even our coaches, there was a while where our business model for the gym, we were still on Yahoo Small Business. And our coaches were like, oh, why aren't you guys on Google? And we're like, because Gmail didn't exist till 2010. Like there was no option for that, right? And so anything that, if you go on the internet and you see some young kid with hair talking about hip range of motion, it was the dark ages. And now it's not the dark ages. So we've seen everyone, I think generally when it was a lot easier when I was going out and teaching because I'd be like, this is your hip. And then people were like, that's amazing. It's attached to my leg. I just PR'd on my deadlift. And I was like, yep, that's how low the bar was. Like no one knew how to do any of this. And now the world has gotten a lot more sophisticated, but lacks some of that naivete and complexity. And some of that happens, you can even see it at CrossFit, where when everyone started CrossFitting, it was so intense and so gnarly. Fran, which is thrusters and pull-ups, is 45 reps. Like, that's not a lot of volume. I don't know, like deadlifting 225 for 45 reps it's not a lot of volume. It's just not. And everyone was protected by the fact that they were not very strong, not very fit, not very skilled. And now fast forward a decade and people are monstrous in so many things. And what's mattered more is technique. I think I was a little ahead of the curve in terms of saying, why isn't our technique matching what your body should be able to do? And why are you not caring about your technique? And now we're starting to see that technique matters because, as Franz Bosch said, there's more variation in waltzing than there is in sprinting. None of us were really sprinting. Only a few of us were. Now a lot of us are sprinting.
Now, you mentioned new book. What's the date on that?
Probably just with the chaos of this little thing called the pandemic and supply chains, it'll be like February in 23. Believe it or not.
Oh, wow. Okay, so this is going to be another monster then.
It'll be a monster. It'll be a monster. And we have to, I feel like if we all don't start aiming at a little bit different society, and we can do this, you don't have to have some lofty vision and write a book or have some award-winning blog or something. You need to coach your clients' kids. That's what you need to do. You need to go as a coach, go volunteer your services and be an assistant in the weight room at your local high school. Right? That's how we'll transform society. We have to look at where this next generation is coming through. And I think that this sounds terrible. And I don't, I'm a humanist and I believe everyone can change. But there's a generation of people for which it's going to be a lot harder to change. And we may have lost them because they weren't moving, they weren't eating, they weren't sleeping. It's a really difficult bell. It's the physiology is complex to unring. So if we're going to capture this next generation, we have to start a lot earlier. And we learned this. Frankly, I was working in the NFL, and the NFL strength coaches would be like, what the problem is? All these kids are so banged up from college. And I was like, oh, those bloody college coaches. And I go back to college, and they're like, 22 of my 24 All-Americans have knee pain when they squat. These high school coaches suck. I'm like, damn these high school coaches. And I go work in the high schools, and they're like, these middle school kids can't even squat. I'm like, damn these middle school kids. And I'm like, well, elementary. And I'm like, man, what's going on? So we're seeing that we need to start our system and are thinking a lot earlier in the process so that people are prepared for the complexity of training that awaits them potentially.
It's fitting that you seem to still be on the edge of meta impact, which is pretty cool. Like there's a higher, well, no, because we've talked a lot about evolution. I really wanted to get a story out about one time that we popped off. And then you got an angry letter from an actress. I was like, all right, well, that's kind of what I wanted. I wanted to know that the God King bleeds. That's really what I wanted to get out of this. But an overarching theme throughout this conversation was like evolution and impact, right? How you've evolved in your thought processes and how those thought processes have evolved and the questions that you've asked and the answers that you've looked to sort of disseminate on the world. But in doing so, you've also evolved in your way to create meta impact, right? Whether it was putting up Instagram videos where two dusty shithead chiropractic students who just played pool for 4 years while they got a doctorate degree rather than going to class were like, yo, this fucking guy in San Francisco, he's making a lot of sense. From that impact to what we do now and trying to have an impact to going like leaps and bounds. You're always ahead of the curve, it seems, even in the content you put out, and talking about maybe the evolution of technique now catching up to your thought process beforehand, how you spearheaded the physical therapy to more movement centric in the way that you focus your treatment to even like on a maturity level. Like I want, still, I think if you ask me now, like, who do you want to be when you grow up? I'm like, Kelly Starrett. I think I want to be, I want to be a level-headed, well-traveled, I mute people rather than like, I wonder if I can find an Ace Hardware near this guy's gym in Boulder and get my ball peen hammer there. I'm 31 years old. And if like someone comments a negative thing, I started up on the YouTube again and there's like a dislike thing and it's completely anonymous. It's like you can't, I don't think, at least I haven't figured it out yet, you can't see who the down thumb is. I lose sleep. I was like, who takes the time?
I have put up a video and then it'll have 4 comments and it'll 4 downs and 2 views. And I'm like, not sure. And I'm like, that is some kind of cool algorithm by the Russians. Obviously, that's what it is. And they're trying to subvert our technique. If I compare, I think that, I'm 48 years old now, and I start to look back and see, we're the same age in my brain, just so you know, except you have more hair.
You look
And
better though. I look like I've lived in a humidor. Are you joking me? Come on, look at you. You're vibrant. I haven't slept my right eye has been twitching for 6 months.
It happens. What's cool is I feel like I'm in this cusp generation of masters to the stellar savages who are ruling the domain right now. And I really am this kind of weird bridge in between sort of this new school tech. We have all of the tools. What does it look like? Your iteration and the sophistication of being 31, I would not even be able to understand what you were saying when I was 31. That's how the progress. But you guys, because you live in it, you can't appreciate it. And I'm not just trying to blow smoke. What I'm saying is I'm seeing this next generation of coaches who are also practitioners who are blowing it out of the water, making a life for themselves. And one of the things that we haven't talked about here is how the three of us have sort of rejected this traditional treatment model where there's burnout and massive amounts of student loan debt and you don't really have a life. And, we are all like, yeah, I don't think that I'm going to go into this traditional way. That's breaking the system. That is completely breaking the system. Then you guys and the men and women who are having podcasts, having these conversations, and the transparency of it and the highlighting of the people that you want to talk to and the thinking, that is the evolution of what's going on. And look, as long as you just take a look at the model of how people are interacting on the internet around science or vaccine or nutrition, you can see that humans are very, very tribal and don't have meaning or meaningful lives. I don't mean that. They don't have a lot of really close relationships and things, so they have to find identity in other communities. That's how we find safety. And so it's not anyone's fault. It's just it's an expression of our current lifestyles where you don't know your neighbors, but you can argue with, if you want to see like how evolved people are, just go into next door, in your local neighborhood and just see what people are talking about. And, it's a microcosm of the fact that we're too far away. If you put all the good coaches who argue in the same room, they will just have much more civil discourse. And so what we're already seeing is that this next generation of coaches are doing much better job of bringing people into the tent instead of pushing people out of the tent. That old model will go away, or at least it will tone down a little bit. You can't swoop and poop and you can't crap on people nonstop. You have to improve the ball, and no one's improving the ball.
When I lived in Campbell, California, someone posted a picture that they took of me on Nextdoor and put out like a warning about a sketchy dude in the neighborhood. I was like, I fucking live here. Dude, I live here. I pay rent in some fucker's backyard. I was like, oh God, I think it's time for me to leave California. But like, it's much to your point.
It's
like,
possible.
Just like didn't even come up to say hi. And I was just like, dude, I've been walking through the same gate. My 4Runner's been parked in front of this house for like 2 years. And the guy would rather try to be like, warning, neighbors, man seen walking mid-20s man, 6 foot, whatever. Like, I was just like, it's me. And like my landlord came up and was just like, you're not going to fucking believe this. And I was like, oh, thanks. I appreciate someone's going to stop me for like a credit check. But no, man, we like, obviously, all those things you said about us being in our early 30s and figuring all this shit out, there wouldn't be anything to figure out, right? Like you definitely spearheaded this so as an attempt to put some praise back on us and just being the most humble piece of shit ever. Like, just stop, man. Stop. No. Like, it's, and that is a true testament to like your character and how you continue to push the industry ahead, an industry that you made. And you don't know anything to us. You know anything to anyone. If I was in this situation and two jackasses like us emailed, I'd be like, fuck that. I'd send, unless you send us an invoice after, I'd be like, you are the best of us. We'll have to do this again.
Juliet and I we do. I just want to say that,
yeah.
Follow up, that Juliet and I have a third rule, right? Which is we want to do dope shit with dope people. And that really is what this is all about. We train not to just be ourselves, but it's how we relate and how we interact. And the gym and the training community and coaching community are my people. I will talk to any coach anytime. And if we can actually train together, the better. Because We don't just need to talk about it. We need to be about it. And that, if you really want to know someone, you must fight them, right? And
You want to be the man, beat the man.
That's right. So, what I say is, let's take this next conversation in person.
How's next weekend?
Online. Yeah, exactly right.
No,
and
I'm
let's
flying to
get
California
together
tomorrow.
and coach. You can come and coach and train here anytime. And we, that's what we need more of is show me, because if we can demonstrate how the patterns overlap, that mutually accommodating system, I think what people realize is, well, we have a lot of tools doing the same thing. So like you like a spoon, I like a fork, but that doesn't change. You make a fire with match, I make a fire with, with a stick and saw. I mean, again, it's still the same principles. I think that's what people confuse it. But I'm from the match tribe, and I'm like, okay, like we're not moving anything forward. So, keep it up, and we're just. I really feel like, and hear this, if we don't get it better at the end of our tenure, shame on us. We have all the tools and all the communication models and media that the masters in front of us did not. It is up to us.
Yeah, I think the underlying
I think one of the most impactful things that I got from your book was the idea of responsibility, right? And that sounds like that's kind of what you're conveying here, is that it's your responsibility to understand how your body works. No one's going to tell you how to do it. You have to learn about it, and you have to pursue that.
Right.
And that sounds like that's, that kind of is the pay it forward principle. It's our responsibility at this point to leave it better than we found it.
I keep waiting to show up to a place where everyone's like, I know all this already. And I'm like, like I can like, my work here is done. I'm gone, but we haven't done a good enough job. And the last thing I just have to say is, I don't know if you guys watched, the documentary about Anthony Bourdain. Of course you did. But there's a part where he's doing some jujitsu with his wife in his house. Did you see that part?
Yeah.
And they pan pass, and there's a supernova, and there's a battle star, and our products are on his floor. And it hit me so hard that like something I thought of was in Anthony Bourdain's house that he rolled on. I was like, my work here is done.
Yeah, I think
that's PR for sure.
That's the
Lifetime
John
PR.
Wayne ride off into the sunset, man. But no, seriously, we're flying to San Francisco tomorrow. We're currently in Toronto. I'll
you guys aren't allowed,
here.
are you?
Hey?
You aren't allowed to come, are you?
Yeah, we're
coming to California yet? I mean,
come hell or high water.
I mean, are Canadians allowed to leave Toronto right now?
I've been on 36 flights this year. You're not stopping me, man. I'll fucking DHL myself. I don't give a fuck.
So first of all, for sure, let's do it. Second of all, usually I would come up to Good Life and speak once a year.
Yep.
And Toronto, if you can have a crush on the city, like I think Toronto is a little bit like Kesha for some reason. Like I love Toronto. She's kind of dirty and nasty, but like deep down inside, it's such a clean, rad, wholesome city. It's Kesha, and I love Toronto. I love Toronto.
Well, dude, we're sitting inside 40,000 square feet. If you ever want to come let loose and rap, say the word, we'll make it happen. We'll roll out the red carpet for you.
That's awesome.
But
I'm in. I just, you guys, thank you.
No, thank you so much. We want to be cognizant of your time as you're solving much larger problems than we are.